In July 2004, the city of Corpus Christi, Texas, was shaken by a senseless act of violence that would echo through the courts and eventually reach the highest levels of justice in America. Pablo Castro, a 46-year-old father of 9 and a hardworking convenience store clerk, was just trying to finish his shift when he crossed paths with 3 strangers. Among them was 20-year-old John Henry Ramirez, a man spiraling into addiction and desperation. What happened next was brutal. In a desperate attempt to steal money for drugs, Ramirez attacked Castro, stabbing him 29 times for just $1.25. Pablo never made it home that night. His children were left without a father, and his community left in grief. Ramirez fled to Mexico, evading capture for nearly 4 years, but justice eventually caught up. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Yet his story didn't end there. His case would halt multiple executions, spark a historic Supreme Court battle over religious freedom, and force America to ask hard questions about faith, forgiveness, and final justice. When his time finally came inside the Huntsville death chamber in October 2022, Ramirez's last words were directed to the family of the man he killed. If this helps you, then I am glad. I hope in some shape or form this helps you find closure. I fought a good fight. I am ready to go. I am ready, Warden. But before we understand how a $1.25 robbery turned into a national debate over the death penalty, religion, and redemption, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just tell the story of a crime. It tells the story of a fight for faith on death row. Pablo Castro was a 46-year-old father of 9 and a familiar face in Corpus Christi, Texas. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't powerful, but to those who knew him, he was everything a man could be: hardworking, kind, and devoted to his children. Pablo had spent much of his life providing for his family, often working long hours at a local convenience store to make sure there was food on the table and a roof over their heads. Friends and neighbors would later recall him as soft-spoken, humble, and generous, the kind of man who never hesitated to help others even when he had little himself. For Pablo, the late-night shifts were grueling, but they were part of his commitment to doing whatever it took to keep his family afloat. On the night of July 19, 2004, Pablo was nearing the end of another long shift at the Times Market convenience store, just a few blocks from his home. It was late, the streets were quiet, and he was tired but ready to clock out and head back to his children. He could not have known that 3 strangers were wandering the city that same night, desperate, intoxicated, and searching for money to fuel a drug habit. One of them was a 20-year-old named John Henry Ramirez. What happened next would change the Castro family forever. In the parking lot of the store, Pablo's path crossed with Ramirez. In a sudden explosion of violence, the father who had worked so hard to give his children a better life was attacked and stabbed 29 times over a mere $1.25. Pablo collapsed just feet away from the store he had faithfully served, his life cut short in an act of unimaginable cruelty. For his 9 children, the man they called father was gone. For his community, the face they knew behind the counter would never return. And for the city of Corpus Christi, the murder of Pablo Castro would leave a scar that still lingers nearly 2 decades later. Guidance that left him searching for belonging in all the wrong places. As a boy, he often felt overlooked, drifting between family members and struggling to find structure or stability. By his teenage years, the cracks in his foundation had widened. He turned to alcohol and drugs, substances that quickly consumed him, and he began running with peers who were just as lost as he was. The streets of Corpus Christi became both his refuge and his downfall. By his early 20s, Ramirez had sunk deeper into addiction, his life spiraling further out of control. He had dropped out of school, cycled through low-paying jobs, and found himself entangled in petty crime. He often spoke of feeling trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape, numbing his pain with drugs while drifting further from any chance of redemption. He wasn't alone in this spiral. He surrounded himself with others living in the same haze of desperation and poor decisions. On the night of July 19, 2004, Ramirez and two acquaintances set out into the darkened streets of Corpus Christi. They weren't looking for work, or hope, or even shelter. They were looking for cash, anything to feed their drug habit. What began as a desperate search for a quick score turned into a fateful decision that would alter the course of many lives forever. In their haze of addiction and recklessness, they set their sights on a convenience store clerk, a man they did not know, a man who had simply been working late to provide for his family. For John Henry Ramirez, the choices he made that night would seal his fate. Within hours, he would go from being just another troubled young man in Corpus Christi to the perpetrator of one of the city's most shocking murders, a crime that would put him on the path to Texas death row. It was the night of July 19th, 2004, and 46-year-old Pablo Castro was finishing up another long shift at the Times Market convenience store in Corpus Christi. The clock crept toward midnight as he stepped outside, perhaps weary but ready to head home to the family who depended on him. In the stillness of that night, he had no way of knowing that danger was already closing in. At the same time, 20-year-old John Henry Ramirez and two accomplices were roaming the streets. Their mission was not work or family. It was desperation. Out of money, high on drugs, and hungry for more, they wandered aimlessly, looking for an easy target to rob. When they spotted Pablo alone outside the store, carrying little more than the cash from his shift, their decision was made in an instant. Ramirez approached first. Without warning, the encounter exploded into violence. In a frenzy of rage and addiction-fueled recklessness, Ramirez pulled a knife and attacked. He stabbed Pablo Castro over and over again, 29 times in total, each thrust tearing away the life of a man who had done nothing more than serve his community and work to feed his children. When it was over, Pablo collapsed in the parking lot, bleeding out under the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights. The total sum taken from him was just $1.25. As Pablo lay dying, Ramirez and his accomplices fled. They left behind a shattered family, a devastated community, and a crime scene so brutal it would haunt investigators for years to come. In the aftermath, Pablo's 9 children would struggle to understand why their father had been taken from them in such a senseless way. Meanwhile, Ramirez, now branded a killer, slipped away into the night, eventually fleeing south across the border into Mexico, where he would remain hidden for nearly 4 years before justice finally caught up with him. In the aftermath of the brutal murder of Pablo Castro, Corpus Christi police launched an intensive investigation. The crime scene told a story of chaos and violence. 29 stab wounds, a discarded knife, and a clerk's body lying just feet from the store he had faithfully served. Witnesses described seeing Ramirez and his companions roaming the area that night, their behavior erratic and desperate. Detectives quickly pieced together the chain of events and identified John Henry Ramirez as the prime suspect. But by the time they closed in, Ramirez was gone. He had slipped out of Corpus Christi and vanished across the border into Mexico, leaving his accomplices behind to face arrest and charges. For years, Pablo's family lived with not only the grief of his murder, but the torment of knowing the man responsible had escaped justice. While his children grew up without their father, Ramirez built a fugitive's life in hiding, drifting through border towns and living under the radar. But investigators never stopped looking. They tracked leads, interviewed associates, and watched for mistakes. In 2008, after nearly 4 years on the run, Ramirez was finally located and arrested. His return to Texas set the stage for a trial that would grip the city of Corpus Christi. Prosecutors wasted no time making their intentions clear. The sheer brutality of Pablo's murder, the 29 stab wounds over a handful of coins, demanded the ultimate punishment. To them, this was not only a robbery gone wrong, but an act of savagery that tore a father away from 9 children. In the courtroom, Pablo's sons and daughters testified to the devastating loss of their father, their voices carrying both grief and anger as they pressed for justice. With Ramirez back in custody, the long journey toward the death chamber had officially begun. After his 2009 conviction and death sentence, John Henry Ramirez was transferred to Texas death row in Huntsville, where he would spend more than a decade awaiting his fate. Life on death row was a constant cycle of appeals, legal filings, and long stretches of isolation in a small cell, with only the uncertainty of when his execution date might finally come. His execution was scheduled multiple times, but each time, something intervened. In 2017, Ramirez received a temporary reprieve after a change in his legal representation created questions about whether he had been adequately defended. That delay kept him alive, at least for the moment. Then, in 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic swept through the prison system and ground the courts to a halt, another scheduled execution was postponed, giving Ramirez yet another unexpected extension of life. But the most consequential development came in 2021, when Ramirez's legal team pursued an appeal that reached the highest court in the nation. This time, it wasn't about the crime itself, but about his final rights as a condemned man. Ramirez, a devout Christian by then, requested that his spiritual advisor be allowed to lay hands on him and pray aloud during the lethal injection. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice initially denied the request, arguing it would compromise security protocols in the execution chamber. Ramirez challenged the denial, and the case quickly escalated into a national debate over religious freedom, capital punishment, and the rights of the condemned at the moment of death. The case, titled Ramirez versus Collier, made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where justices heard arguments about whether Texas was violating federal law by restricting religious practices in the execution chamber. In March 2022, the court ruled in Ramirez's favor, affirming that even those sentenced to death retain certain constitutional protections. For Ramirez, the decision meant that when his time finally came, he would not die alone in silence. His pastor would be allowed to pray over him and touch him as the lethal drugs were administered. This ruling delayed Ramirez's execution once more, but it also set a legal precedent with implications far beyond his case, influencing how executions would be carried out across the United States. For the Castro family, however, the repeated delays felt like an agonizing cycle, prolonging their grief and preventing true closure. And yet, despite the setbacks and stays, the state of Texas remained resolute. John Henry Ramirez would face justice for the murder of Pablo Castro. It was only a question of when. In 2021, John Henry Ramirez's appeals took an unexpected turn when he made a request that would ignite a national conversation about religion, the death penalty, and the rights of the condemned. Ramirez, who had become a devout Christian while on death row, asked that his longtime spiritual advisor, Pastor Dana Moore of the Second Baptist Church in Corpus Christi, be permitted to accompany him into the execution chamber, pray aloud over him, and lay hands on him in his final moments. For Ramirez, this was not a mere preference, but a matter of deep faith. He believed that having his pastor's prayerful presence as he crossed from life into death was essential to his spiritual peace. Texas prison officials, however, rejected the request, citing security concerns. They argued that allowing a pastor to pray out loud or physically touch Ramirez during the lethal injection procedure could disrupt the process or endanger staff. Ramirez responded by filing a lawsuit, claiming that this denial violated his rights under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, RLUIPA, a federal law designed to protect the religious freedoms of incarcerated individuals. The case quickly gained attention, not only because it was unusual, but because it touched on profound questions about the balance between state authority and constitutional rights at the very threshold of death. The lawsuit, titled Ramirez versus Collier, made its way to the highest court in the land. On March 24, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a 6-3 ruling in Ramirez's favor. In a majority opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court affirmed that condemned inmates must be allowed to practice their faith at the moment of execution unless the state can demonstrate that doing so would create a significant security risk. The ruling did not just apply to Ramirez. It set a landmark precedent that would influence death penalty practices across the nation, ensuring that religious accommodations could not be denied without compelling justification. For Ramirez, The decision meant that when the state of Texas carried out his execution, Pastor Dana Moore would be allowed to place his hands on him and pray aloud, granting him the spiritual comfort he had sought. For advocates of religious liberty, the case was hailed as a major victory. But for the Castro family, who had already endured 18 years of hearings, delays, and legal wrangling, it was yet another reminder of how long justice had taken. Still, the ruling underscored a profound truth. Even in the most final moments of life, the Constitution demands that certain fundamental rights be preserved. In October 2022, after nearly 2 decades of delays, appeals, and legal battles, the state of Texas set a final execution date for John Henry Ramirez. The notice marked the end of a long and turbulent journey through the justice system, and this time, there would be no more stays. In the days leading up to his execution, Ramirez was moved to a holding cell near the death chamber inside the Huntsville unit, where condemned inmates spend their final hours. The atmosphere was heavy with inevitability. Guards checked on him at regular intervals, while supporters and opponents of the death penalty gathered outside the prison gates, holding vigils, candles, and signs calling for either mercy or justice. Inside, Ramirez's focus turned to his faith. Pastor Dana Moore, the man whose presence at the execution had been secured through the Supreme Court case Ramirez versus Collier, visited him frequently, reading from Scripture, praying with him, and preparing him spiritually for the end. Unlike many death row inmates who request elaborate final meals, Ramirez's choice was simple and reflective of his cultural roots. He asked for barbacoa tacos, seasoned pork, and a glass of water. The modest meal stood in sharp contrast to the violence that had once defined his life, symbolizing, in many ways, a man trying to embrace humility in his final hours. On the afternoon of October 5, 2022, Ramirez was escorted from his cell for the last time. As the sun began to set over Huntsville, he met with Pastor Moore for one final prayer. The two men bowed their heads, and Ramirez, who had once lived in the shadows of addiction and violence, sought forgiveness, redemption, and peace. Outside, candlelight vigils continued as the community of Corpus Christi, especially the family of Pablo Castro, braced themselves for the long-awaited moment of closure. For Ramirez, those final hours were a mixture of ritual and reckoning. A last meal, final prayers, and the knowledge that the clock was ticking toward the moment when the state of Texas would exact its ultimate punishment. On the evening of October 5, 2022, the long-awaited day of reckoning arrived. At 6:27 p.m., John Henry Ramirez was led into the execution chamber of the Huntsville unit, the same room where more than 500 men and women before him had met their end. Calm but solemn, he was strapped to the gurney by correctional officers. Leather restraints tightened across his arms, legs, and chest as the witnesses filed quietly into their viewing areas. Standing close by his side was Pastor Dana Moore, the man whose presence had been guaranteed by the landmark Supreme Court case bearing Ramirez's name. As Ramirez lay still beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, Pastor Moore placed one hand gently on his chest and lowered his head to whisper prayers, a final act of spiritual comfort granted at the edge of life and death. When asked if he had any last words, Ramirez turned his gaze toward the family of Pablo Castro, who had waited nearly 2 decades to see justice carried out. His voice was steady as he spoke. "If this helps you, then I am glad. I hope in some shape or form this helps you find closure. I love you all. I fought a good fight. I am ready to go. I am ready, Warden." The words, though simple, carried the weight of finality, a recognition of the pain he had caused and a farewell to both his loved ones and the life he was leaving behind. As the lethal drugs began to flow through the four-line, Ramirez and Pastor Moore prayed together one last time, their voices soft but audible in the chamber. "Amen," Ramirez said as his eyes grew heavy. Within moments, his breathing slowed and silence filled the room. At 6:41 p.m., John Henry Ramirez was officially pronounced dead by lethal injection at the age of 38. Outside the prison, news cameras captured the announcement while vigils continued in the dark, a mix of relief, sorrow, and reflection among those gathered. For the family of Pablo Castro, it was the end of an 18-year journey through grief and the justice system. For Ramirez, it was the final chapter of a life marked by violence, faith, and ultimately, a quiet surrender in the death chamber. This was the story of John Henry Ramirez and Pablo Castro, a crime that devastated a family, tested the justice system, and left behind a legacy that reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But now, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was served, or do the years of appeals and delays show deeper flaws in the system? Share your views in the comments below. And if you found this documentary insightful, don't forget to give it a like, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to Crime Report Network for more in-depth documentaries that uncover the darkest and most shocking cases from around the world. Your support helps us continue to bring you these powerful stories.